What's going on, guys? Alpha the Wizard back at it with another video. Today we're going to be continuing the meta history of Yu-Gi-Oh! And we're on year 2007. So we're going to be covering the decks that were prominent from March all the way to September of 2007. In the last few videos I covered Diamond Dude Turbo and Demise OTK, which were arguably the two best decks of the format. But then we also had other decks like this deck, which is also called Machine OTK, where this deck would opt to utilize cards like Future Fusion to get a Chimera Tech Overdragon or even a Cyber Twin Dragon, or just some more really good power spells similar to that. So without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and hop right into the profile. So we'll just start with the big boss monsters. Starting with Dark Magician of Chaos. You can't really play this deck without this card because you have so many power spells that end up in the graveyard, and this card just lets you very easily recycle it. And it's very common in this deck to have two monsters on the field at any given time, just because of the recursion aspect and also playing Cyber Dragon. But then we do also play one copy of Jinzo. Now, as prominent as Jinzo is in this format, and almost every single deck plays it, it's also a machine, so it inherently synergizes with this strategy a little bit better. Yeah, Jinzo is definitely probably, if not the best card of this format, most definitely one of the best. But then we are opting to play 3 copies of Cyber Dragon. Now, Cyber Dragon is mandatory in this strategy, mainly because we are opting to send monsters with Future Fusion, which can immediately fuel our graveyard for another broken spell, like Overload Fusion, and then just make quick quick fusions on the fly. So yeah, this deck can OTK really quick and really easy, and it's actually very efficient at what it does. And then we also, onto the smaller machines, we play 3 copies of Cyber Phoenix. Now, Cyber Phoenix is another core component to the strategy. It may seem weak, but don't let it be underestimated, because this card is actually really good. So it can negate the effects of any spell or trap card that targets a machine monster on the field. But it has to be in attack position. But that effect alone is really, really strong, mainly because there is a lot of cards that target this format. So this card is an out to a lot of them, and you can send a lot of machines to make Chimera Tech Overdragon. So worst case scenario, you can just send this to the graveyard, and if this gets destroyed as a result of battle, you can draw a card. So it's very good for recursion as well. And then, since they are machines, we also play 3 copies of Dekoichi. Dekoichi is really good in this strategy because A, it is a machine, but B, this is one of the better recursion cards in this modern era of Yu-Gi-Oh! Yeah, so we also have to maximize on the infamous Card Trooper. So, Card Trooper is really good this format, solely for the reason we have machine duplication, and this card is at 3. Now that just sounds insane to me, Card Trooper just being at 3 at this time. And then the cards that are non-machines that we need to play, essentially, are 2 copies of Snipe Hunter. Snipe Hunter inherently just deals with problems. So yeah, there might be often times in this deck where you have like a big monster that you can't out, because a lot of our monsters are relatively small and we might be trying to stage for an OTK. So Snipe Hunter can just clear the way of those big monsters and allow us to just kind of do our thing. But then in addition, you know, every deck at the time had to play Sangan. Sangan is just one of the best cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's history in all these retro formats. And then last but not least, for the monsters, we do play 1 copy of Morphing Jar. Morphing Jar is really, really good in this deck because we can just like refuel our hand and dump a bunch of machine monsters to the graveyard and then just redraw a hand. So yeah, it synergizes really, really well with the strategy, and a lot of people might not see it coming. Alright, but yeah, so that's really it for all the monsters that you would want to play in this deck. Now moving on to the power spells. So I'm going to start with the OTK spells first. We have Future Fusion. Now, Future Fusion is just really, really broken in tandem with Overload Fusion. Now, Overload Fusion allows you to banish machines that are listed on a fusion as material from your graveyard, and you can summon, the required machine. Future Fusion allows you to dump those materials in the graveyard turn 1. Years later, this card did eventually get an errata, so it's not as broken as it used to be, but in this day and age of Yu-Gi-Oh! Back in 2007, Future Fusion was pre-errata, so this card is even better at this time. And then for OTK purposes, we do play limiter removal because it's very common for us to get maybe a Cyber Twin on the field and just OTK in the battle phase and they don't see it coming because of limiter, or we can make Chimera Tech Overdragon if our Future Fusion does resolve and drop a Chimera that is gigantic and then limiter removal and attack over anything. But then we do also have to play the cards that help facilitate us being able to OTK, such as Mystical Space Typhoon and Giant Trunade. This just clears the way so that we can just essentially go for game at times. And then since the card is legal, we do play one copy of Confiscation. This deck is basically, we're trying to rip their hand a lot in this particular build. This is Philly Luna's build from March of 2007. So I did take his deck profile. There may be some slight changes just over history of me having this based on card choices that I preferred. But however, his deck did play Confiscation, and for good reason, because you'll see later that we do play 3 Trap Dust Shoot. So yeah, Confiscation, we're trying to eliminate any problematic cards so that we can set up and kill them relatively fast. And since there are quite a few sets this format, we do still play 1 copy of Nobleman of Crossout, because if we do play, let's say, like the Mirror Match, which could be very common, Machines was a pretty popular strategy around this time. So if you weren't playing Diamond Dude Turbo or Demise OTK, you were probably playing somewhere along the lines of this deck. So yeah, that just makes Nobleman of Crossout really prevalent in the format because there's going to be a lot of set monsters. And then of course we have the mandatory staples of the time. We have Brain Control. We actually play 2 copies of Brain Control, my apologies, in addition with a Snatch Steal. So yeah, this deck we're trying to clear the way for an OTK. And with this being said, we can take 2 of their monsters, drop a Cyber Twin Dragon with Overload Fusion, and then just attack for game. So yeah, these staples are even more prevalent in this deck, more so than the other ones, just because we are trying to just remove their monsters and make a big attack. And then of course we play Premature Burial, which is a mandatory staple of this time, and we do play Scapegoat. Scapegoat just doesn't lose value in this time of Yu-Gi-Oh! Because it is just going to let you buy more turns and eventually get to your OTK pieces. And then to help get to those OTK pieces a little bit faster, we do play Pot of Avarice. Now this card is limited to 1, so we can only play 1 copy, but Avarice is really good because if we're trying to make a Chimera Tech Overdragon, we can send as many machines as we want from our deck to the graveyard, and if we open Pot of Avarice, we can just draw 2 free cards. But yeah, so that's really it for the power spells of this deck. Now moving on to the trap cards, as I previously mentioned, we are trying to control our opponent's hand basically, so we do play 3 copies of Trap Dust Shoot. Trap Dust Shoot is really good at this time because if you're playing against Demise OTK, which is probably why he opted to main this card as opposed to siding it, is because your opponent is trying to stage for an OTK. So if you Trap Dust Shoot and you hit their Demise back to deck, or even in Diamond Dude Turbo, it's relatively decent because, if you do this in standby phase and they have like, a Stratos and a D-Draw, you can just shuffle back to Stratos and make their D-Draw dead. So yeah, Trap Dust Shoot has so much value this format. But since we're trying to know exactly what our opponent's hand is, we do play 1 singular copy of Mind Crush. Now you may think this card is really bad going first, however, This is a slower format. You know, with the exception of Diamond Dude Turbo, who can just really pop off at any given time, Mind Crush is also good against them as well, because it's very common for you to know like at least one of their cards in hand, and if you can prevent like a D-draw, that can really shut down their turn. And for the power traps that pretty much every deck played at this time, we have Torrential Tribute for obvious reasons. And then Mirror Force was one of the better power traps of this format because people had to play around this, and this was an OTK format. So people really had to clear your back row before they could really make any pushes because of Mirror Force. And then because it's not banned yet, we do play a singular copy of Ring of Destruction. It's another power spell that can also help us OTK. We can get our opponent's life points down low enough and then try to just swing with a big Cyber Twin Dragon with Metamorphosis for game. That play can come up. And then last but not least, we do play a singular copy of Call the Haunted. Call the Haunted is really good because we're just dumping so many cards from deck to the graveyard. So pretty much we can just dump a Jinzo with Future Fusion and a bunch of other machines, and then we can just revive the Jinzo on our opponent's turn. But yeah, so that's really it for the power traps. Now, I'm not going to go too in-depth with the extra deck, but I will just go over some options that you might want to play. So to start things off, I will say this card is actually mandatory. So we have to play Cyber Twin Dragon. This is the card that you are looking to OTK with more times than not, because Cyber Twin is very easy to facilitate because we are playing Cyber Dragons in 3 of them, and we can recycle them with Pot of Avarice as well. So yeah, Cyber Twin Dragon has so much value and so much OTK potential in this deck. So yeah, and then for the other options that we can make, we have the second best options, Chimera Tech Overdragon. Now this card is very strong because its attack strength is equivalent to how many monsters you send to the graveyard times 800. So if you only send 2, it's at 16, you know, 3s, 24, so on and so forth. So you could very easily just send a bunch of them and make him over 10,000 attack and then just swing for 1 punch for game. But it's never really that easy, which is why Cyber Twin is usually the better option to go for, unless you open like Pot of Avarice. So yeah, we have those. And then the last but not least, one that you probably will make but not too often, is Cyber End Dragon. Now this card does come up surprisingly. So if you end up with 3 Cyber Dragons in graveyard and use Future Fusion to try to get to Chimera Tech Overlord, and you have this one spell that banishes the Fusion Summon, you can very easily just bring this out by sending 3 Cyber Dragons off your Future Fusion. But yeah, so Cyber End Dragon does come up, but it's probably the one that comes up the least. But yeah, that really does it for this profile. Definitely make sure you stay tuned for the next episode. We're definitely going to be covering some more old formats and more good options, you know, in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! So with that being said, this is Alpha the Wizard signing out.